Hey students, I'm gonna read chapter 7 and read chapter 8. Since these chapters are so short, normally we've been doing 2 chapters per class because to read 2 chapters, it's barely even 15 minutes. Now we've been talking about the theme of when do you not obey? Like when do you stop obeying? Now we go to the book of Romans and Paul writes, obey the king. As a Christian, obey the government. Why should we obey the government? Because God put them in place. But Scripture also says, don't obey the government if the government is going against God's law. Then you have to civilly disobey. And we call that civil disobedience. So if the government, it doesn't matter, this is just me personally, wherever I live, let's say I'm in Russia, and the government comes to me and says like, hey, Mr. Williams, we don't really like Christians, so you're going to help us go around and we're just going to like kill Christians. I'm going to be like, I'm not going to cooperate. And if they say, well, we're going to lock you up and we're going to put you in a prison camp, or you might face death, well then you might have to face death. I know these are hard things I'm talking about, but if you stand up, if you really stand up for what you believe in, it means you're a person of character. If you fold, meaning if you give in, it means you were never really a believer in the first place and you don't really have character. And so we're talking about when, at what point do we disobey the government? So I want us to think about this because we're going to be talking about this in the next couple classes. So chapter 7. By mid-September, Luke's days had fallen into a familiar pattern. He got up at dawn just for the chance to sit on the stairs and watch the rest of his family eat breakfast. And they all rushed now, and Mother had to be at the factory by 7, and Dad was trying to get all the machinery in working order before harvest. Matthew and Mark were back in school, and only Luke had time to linger over his undercooked bacon and dry toast. He didn't bother asking for butter because that meant someone would have to stand up and bring it over to him, and all the while pretending for the sake of the open window that they had just forgotten something upstairs. As soon as the rest of the family had stomped out the door, Luke went back to his room and watched out the vents. First out the front to see Matthew and Mark climb onto the school bus, then out the back, where the new houses were practically finished. They were mansions, as large as the Garner's house and barn put together. They gleamed in the morning sunlight as though their walls were studded with precious jewels. For all Luke knew, maybe they were. Hordes of workmen still arrived every morning, but almost all of them worked indoors now. They headed into the houses first thing, carrying rolls of carpet, stacks of drywall, cans of paint. Luke couldn't see much of them after that. He spent more time now watching a new kind of traffic. Expensive-looking cars driving slowly down the newly paved streets. Sometimes they pulled into a driveway, went into one of the houses, usually trailing a woman who appeared to be talking non-stop. It had taken Luke a while to figure it out. He certainly hadn't dared ask anyone else in his family, but he thought maybe the people were thinking about buying the houses. Once he realized that, he studied each potential neighbor carefully. He'd overheard Mother and Dad marveling that the people moving into the new houses were not just going to be city people, but barons. Barons were unbelievably rich. Luke knew they had things ordinary people hadn't had in years. Luke wasn't sure how the barons had gotten rich when everyone else was poor. But Dad never said the word baron without a curse word or two in front of it. The people streaming through the houses did look different from anyone in Luke's family. There were mostly thin, beautiful women in form-fitting dresses and heavy-set men in what Luke's dad and brothers called sissy clothes. Shiny shoes and clean, dressy pants and jackets. Luke always felt a little embarrassed for them, showing up like that. Or maybe he was embarrassed for his family, that they never looked like any of the barons. Luke preferred it when the adults had children with them, and he could concentrate on them. The smallest ones were always as dressed up as their parents, with hair bows and suspenders and other gewgaws Luke knew his parents would never buy. The older kids usually seemed to be wearing whatever they had grabbed first out of their closet that morning. Though he knew no one would dare to show up with 3 kids, he always counted 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. What if a family with just 1 kid moved in behind them? And he sneaked into their house and pretended to be their second child. He could go to school, go to town, act like Matthew and Mark. What a joke! Luke living with barons. More likely he'd be shot for trespassing or turned in. When he began thinking things like that, he always jumped down from his perch by the vent and grabbed a book from one of the dusty stacks by the eaves. Mother had taught him to read and do math, as much as she knew herself. At least we have a few books for you, she often mumbled sadly when she left in the morning. He'd read all their books dozens of times, even the ones with titles like Diseases of the Porcine Species and Common Grasses of Our Countryside. His favorites were the handful of adventure books, the ones that let him pretend he was a knight fighting a dragon to rescue a kidnapped princess, or an explorer sailing on the high seas, holding tight to a mast while a hurricane raged about him. Guys, you have to read Prince Caspian. He liked to forget that he was Luke Garner, 3rd child hidden in the attic. Sometimes around noon, he'd hear the door from the mudroom to the kitchen swing open. He'd go down and eat at the same time as his dad. Without Mother, there were no homemade pies now, no mashed potatoes, no roasts that sent good smells throughout the house. Dad always made 4 sandwiches, checked to make sure no one could see him, then handed 2 of them to Luke in the stairwell. Dad never talked. He'd explain that he didn't want anyone overhearing him and wondering. But he did turn the radio on for the noon farm reports, and there was usually a song or 2 after that before Dad silenced the radio and went outside to work again. When Dad left, Luke went back to his room or read, or to watch the house again, or to watch the houses again. At 6:30, Mother came home, and she always stopped in and said hi to Luke before rushing out to do the whole day's work in the few hours before bedtime. Usually Matthew or Mark came up to visit him too, but they could never stay long either. They had to help Dad before supper, then do their homework afterwards, and they always had been nicest to Luke outdoors. Before the woods came down, the 3 of them often had played kickball or football or spud in the backyard, after school and chores. Matthew and Mark always fought about who got to have Luke on his team because even if Luke wasn't very good, 2 boys together could always beat the 3rd. Now they played half-hearted games of cards or checkers with Luke, but Luke could tell they would rather be outside. So would he. He tried not to think about it. The best part of the day came at the end when Mother tucked him in. She'd be relaxed then. She'd stay for an hour sometimes, asking him what he'd read that day or telling him stories about the factory. Then one night, when she was telling how her plastic glove had gotten stuck in a chicken she'd de-gutted that day, Mother suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence. "Mother," Luke said. She answered with a snore. She'd fallen asleep while sitting up. Luke studied her face, seeing lines of fatigue that hadn't been there before, noticing that the hair around her face now held as much gray as brown. "Mother," he said again, gently shaking her arm. She jerked. "But I cleaned the kitchen, the chicken, sorry. Luke, you need tucking in, don't you?" She fluffed his pillow, smoothed his sheet. Luke sat up. That's okay, Mother. I'm getting too old for this. He swallowed a lump in his throat. Anyway. I bet you weren't still tucking Matthew or Mark in when they were 12. No, she said quietly. Oh, then I don't need it either. Okay, she said. She kissed his forehead anyhow, then turned out the light. Luke turned his face to the wall until she left. Now we're going to chapter 8. It's very interesting because this is Because stuff like this has happened in the past, and this is apocalyptic, looking to the future. And it's very funny because the situation we find ourselves in right now, it's very just like this. Like I said, if today is not my day to go outside, like right now, I can't go out. Meaning, I can't get in my car and drive around. Why? It's not my day. But Luke has it worse. He can't leave the house. Chapter 8. One cool rainy morning a few days later, Luke's family left in such a rush they barely had time to say goodbye. They dashed out the door after breakfast, Matthew and Mark complaining about their packed lunches, and Dad calling back, "I'm going to that auction up at Chidlesville. Won't come home till supper." And Mother hurried back and handed Luke a bag of cracklings and 3 pears and some biscuits from the night before. She muttered, "So you won't get hungry," and gave him a quick kiss on the head, and then she was gone too. Luke peeked around the driveway door, surveying the chaos of dirty pans and crumb-covered plates left in the kitchen. He knew not to look out as far as the window, but he did anyway. His heart gave a strange jump when he saw the window was covered. Someone must have pulled the shade the night before to try to keep the kitchen warm and then forgotten to raise it in the morning. Luke dared to lean out a little further, and yes, the shade was down on the other window too. For the first time in almost 6 months, he could step out into the kitchen and not worry about being seen. He could run, skip, jump, dance, even on the vast linoleum without fear. He could clean up the kitchen and surprise Mother. He could do anything. He put his right foot out, tentatively, not quite daring to put his full weight on it. The floor squeaked. He froze. Nothing happened, but he retreated anyway. He went back up the stairs, crawled along the second-floor hallway to avoid the windows, then climbed the stairs to the attic. He was so disgusted with himself that he could taste it. "I'm a coward. I'm a chicken. I deserve to be locked away in the attic forever," ran through his head. No, he countered himself. "I'm cautious. I'm making a plan." He climbed up onto the stool on the top of a trunk that served as his perch for watching out the back vents. The neighborhood behind his house was fully occupied now. He knew all the families and had come up with names for most of them. The big Carr family had 4 expensive cars sitting in the driveway. The Gold family all had hair in the color of sunshine. The Birdbrain family had a set of row of 30 birdhouses along their backyard fence, even though Luke could have told them it was pointless to do that until spring. The house he could see best, right behind the gardener's backyard, was occupied by the Sports family. 2 teenage boys lived there, and their deck overflowed with soccer balls, baseball bats, tennis rackets, basketballs, hockey sticks, and apparatus from games Luke could only guess at. Today he wasn't interested in games. He was interested in seeing the families leave. He had noticed before that all the houses were empty, and by 9 in the morning, with kids off to school and grown-ups off to work, 3 or 4 of the women didn't seem to have jobs. But they left, too, returning late in the afternoon with shopping bags. Today he just had to make sure no one was staying homesick. No one was staying home sick. The Gold family left first. 2 blonde heads in one car, 2 blonde heads in another. The Sports family was next, the boys carrying football pads and helmets, their mother teetering on high heels. Then there was a flurry of cars steaming from every driveway onto the still sparkling new streets. Luke counted each person, keeping track so carefully that he made scratches on the wall and counted the scratches twice again at the end. Yes, 28 people were gone. He was safe. Luke scrambled down from his chair, his head spinning with plans. First he'd clean up the kitchen, then he'd start some bread for supper. He'd never made bread before, but he'd watched Mother a million times. Then maybe he could pull the shades in the rest of the house and clean it thoroughly. He couldn't vacuum, that would be too loud, but he could dust and scrub and polish. Mother would be so pleased, and then in the afternoon, before Matthew or Mark or the kids in the neighborhood got back, he could put something on for supper. Maybe potato soup. Why, he could do this every day. He'd never considered housework or cooking particularly thrilling before. Matthew and Mark always scoffed at it as women's work, but it was better than nothing. And maybe, just maybe, if this worked, he could convince Dad to let him sneak out to the barn and help there too. Luke was so excited, he stepped into the kitchen without a second thought this time. Who cared if the floor creaked? No one was there to hear it. He gathered up dishes from the table and piled them into the sink, scrubbing everything with extraordinary zeal. No reggaeton. Stop. He measured out flour and lard and milk and yeast and was putting it all in a bowl when it occurred to him that it might be okay to turn on the radio very softly. Nobody would hear, but if they did, they just figured the family had gotten to turn it off, just as they'd forgotten to raise the shades. Butch-Steve. The bread was in the oven and Luke was picking up lint by hand from the living room rug when he heard tires on the gravel driveway. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, too early for the school bus or Mother or Dad. Luke sprinted for the stairs, hoping whoever it was would just go away. No luck. He heard the side door creaking open, then Dad exclaiming, "What the?" He was back early. Well, that shouldn't matter, but hiding on the staircase, Luke suddenly felt like the radio was as loud as an entire orchestra, like the smell of baking bread could fill 3 counties. "Luke!" Dad yelled. Luke heard his father's hand on the doorknob. He opened the door. "I was just trying to help." "I was safe. You left the shades down, so I thought it was okay, and I made sure everyone was gone from the neighborhood, and..." "You can't be sure. People like that, they get deliveries all the time. They get sick and come home from work. They have maids come during the day." Luke could have protested. No, the maids never came before the kids got home from school, but he didn't want to give himself away any more than he already had. The shades were down. I didn't turn on a single light. Even if there were 1,000 people back there, nobody would know I was here. Please, I've just got to do something. Look, I made bread, and I cleaned up, and... What if a government inspector or someone had stopped by here? I would have hidden like always. Dad was shaking his head. And leave them smelling bread baking in an empty house? You don't seem to understand. You can't take any chances. You can't because... At that precise moment, the buzzer of the oven went off, sounding as loud as a siren. Dad gave Luke a dirty look and stalked over to the oven. He pulled out the 2 bread pans and tossed them onto the stovetop. He flipped off the radio. I don't want you to go in the kitchen again, he said. You stay hidden, that's an order. He went out of the house without looking back. Luke fled up the stairs. He wanted to stomp angrily, but he couldn't. No noise allowed. In his room, he hesitated, too upset to read, too restless to do anything else. He kept hearing, "You stay hidden, that's an order," echoing in his ears. But he'd been hidden. He'd been careful. To prove his point, to himself at least, he climbed back up on his perch by the back vents and looked out on the quiet neighborhood. All the driveways were empty. Nothing moved. Not even the flag on the Gold family's flagpole or the spokes on the Bird Brain family's fake windmill. Baby phew. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Luke caught a glimpse of something behind one window of the Sports family's house. A face. A child's face. In a house where 2 boys already lived. So this, guys, I would say, is the beginning of suspense in this story. So I'll see you guys for next chapter.